been 15 years since that movie came out. I know. That's what I thought when I was looking at the clip. Have you ever been given a test or a job or responsibility, a task, and then failed it? That's what we just saw in the video clip. In the movie The Matrix, the original, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, is being trained by his mentor, Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne. And we see that he and Morpheus are sparring in the dojo, and Morpheus is encouraging him to be stronger, to be faster, to continue to grow. And then when he's feeling pretty good about himself because of some progress he's making, he does what? He says, load the jump program. And all of a sudden, they're standing on the top of this building, and there's this other building, and Morpheus makes this jump. And the group that's there watching this happen on the monitor, they're very pessimistic. In fact, most of them are like, no way, nobody ever makes the first jump. Nobody's going to do it. A couple of them are holding out hope. Come on, Neo, maybe you can make it. But what ultimately happens? He falls into the squishy ground, bounces up, and then falls, having failed the test. Question we have this morning as we begin, that's a pretty impossible task. Now, within the context of the movie, though, he still fails it nonetheless. But have you ever been given a test, a job, a task, some type of responsibility, and quickly felt or realized that you were probably going to fail? That this was just too much for you to have to accomplish? Maybe as a youth, your parents placed some large responsibility on you, on your shoulders, and you had a lot riding while they were gone, or something was going on, you just remember the weight of that on you, thinking, there's no way I can do this. Or at your workplace. Let's say you've been given a promotion or it's a new job and you're really excited about it, but soon after getting this new position, you realize, I am way in over my head. There's no way that I think I'm going to be able to do this. You're in school. Could be high school, could be college, could be grad school, and maybe you studied really hard, or maybe you just haven't studied, but that midterm or that final's coming, and you realize, and you're like, oh no, I am so ill prepared for what I'm about to have to go through. And that feeling that wells up inside of you. Or maybe it's just being a mother or a father, trying to balance work, trying to balance life at home, trying to balance raising your children, being a model to them, trying to raise them up in a manner which would honor God and help them in their own faith journey. This is the normal struggles of the day. Well, this morning as we continue through our series Street Fighter, and with our message this morning called The Impossible Test, we're in a series where we're going to take a little break from the norm of Jesus kind of defending himself from the religious leaders, which is where we started the first two. He had to defend himself and what he was doing in the name of God, his Father. And he takes a little bit of a turn this morning, and he actually goes into a training mode with his disciples and with his followers. And we're going to focus on that here this morning. And Jesus wasn't just into the fight for himself. His whole purpose, his whole 3 years was invested in who? 12 people. And he had an objective that he wanted to accomplish in their lives before he left, that his mission would then continue. So this morning, if you have your Bibles, and I hope that you do, turn with me to John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Couple interesting notes as you're turning there. John is one of the 4 accounts of the life of Jesus written for the New Testament. And this is the only miracle that Jesus performed that is in all 4 accounts, in all 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But John tells his a little bit differently. It's a little bit different angle, perspective on the same event. And so I'll read. You can follow along with your own Bibles. It will be up on the screen for you as well. John chapter 6, verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip. Philip was one of his disciples, Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get even a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Little commentary here, that means probably 15 to 20,000 people total, with 5,000 men, with women and children included. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." And perceiving that they were about to come by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew to the mountain by himself. All right, so what's happening here? Jesus has been doing some really cool stuff around the region. In fact, last chapter, what did he do with the religious leaders? They came to him, Matt talked about this the last 2 weeks, and they were trying to corner him and convict him of violating religious laws. And what did he end up doing on them? Turn the tables. He ended up putting them on trial, as Matt illustrated. Nobody turned the tables on the Pharisees. And so Jesus is doing things, not just the healing, but he's doing things within the region that people are like, "This is amazing, this is incredible." No one has ever been able to stand up to these religious leaders, in addition to the miracles, it says. The people saw the things he was doing. And so what? So the crowd was following him. Well, in verse 5, there they are up on the mountain with the crowd following them. And John tells us that Jesus looks up and he sees the crowd of people, and then he asks his disciples the impossible. He asks them, "Where are we going to get food to feed these people?" And the key to the passage this morning is there in verse 6. What does John tell us in verse 6? He says that Jesus knew ahead of time what was going to happen. He said this to test them. Now this morning, we're going to be in a series called Street Fighter, where you've got a person battling. It's only appropriate to have a section where you have a training bit, to where people learn how to fight. Because as I said, it wasn't Jesus' objective just to fight himself, but he wanted to invite and train those who were following him as well. And this morning we're going to see how the disciples facing a task that they could not accomplish. It's stated right there in the text in verse 6. Jesus knew they could not do this. How they faced a task they could not accomplish, accomplishes and was part of God's will for them, for the crowd, and for his ultimate purpose there and his ministry. And so, in order to understand, we want to take the disciples' perspective this morning, and I want to again ask the question, how do you and I respond to an impossible task? How do we react when we're faced with a challenge, an obstacle that we seriously doubt or are sure that we cannot overcome? Well, it's great in the passage this morning. We have a couple examples to start. Verse 7, right after Jesus states it's a test, we're given verse 7 because he asked the question to a specific disciple. He asked it to Philip, okay? And he specifically says Philip. Why? Nobody's really sure. Philip lived in the area about 3-4 miles away. They thought, well, maybe Philip knows the region, and he could have known like where the food locations were to feed this many people. By the way, 20,000 people. Think of the Scott Trade Center when the Blues are doing well, okay? 20,000 people roughly, packed to the gills. That's about how many people Jesus is, are in the crowd that are following him. And so Jesus asks Philip, where are we going to find food to feed this many people? And how does Philip answer? He answers this way. 200 denarii, which is about a year or two wages. It's a significant amount of money to cover the food. Worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Now, what's wrong with that answer? What question is Philip answering? He's answering a how much would it cost to feed them question. Is that the question that Jesus asked him? What did Jesus ask him? He asked him, where can we get the food to buy for these many people? And what do we want to take away from that? Well, the first thing we see is that Philip isn't really listening to the question that Jesus is posing to him. Think about that. He's answering a how much when he's being asked a where. He's so preoccupied, or he might be so preoccupied and overwhelmed with the problem, this mass of people, that all of a sudden his senses kind of shut down and the reality of what's being inquired of him is lost. He loses sensibility. And how many of us in a time of stress or trial all of a sudden can remember losing our cohesive and logical thought patterns? Ever been there? Things are getting stressed out at home. Things are getting, you're upset, you're in the middle of a difficult day, and somebody who's totally not at fault calls or stops by, and your anger, which might be faced on children or towards another person, a coworker, all of a sudden is thrust on another person. Is that fair? Is that logical? But the stress of the moment compels us to do that. Some people, when we get overwhelmed, just shrink. And we don't know how to respond. And we lose some of our faculties. We really do. We do not like pressure. And the thought of failure is debilitating. And we get a picture of that here with Philip, answering this how much question. Jesus wasn't worried about the money. He was asking where. Where can we go to get this kind of food? So do you and I overreact? Do we get mad or upset or accuse the wrong people or react wrongly in a situation? Philip did. Philip totally missed the question that Jesus was presenting to him. And then we're given human response number 2 to the impossible test. And we got to give Andrew a little bit of credit, because it says this in verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish." Now, good for Andrew, right? Sees the people, sees the question. All of a sudden, he's scoping the crowd. He's walking around. Anybody got food? He spots a boy with 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he brings them up to Jesus. I found one boy has the food. And then, but what does he say? After his good start and creative endeavor to think outside the box, show some initiative, he tags on to the end of it. But what are they for so many? How many of us, strong starters, initiative right off the bat, and we face some opposition, and all of a sudden cynicism, doubt, we're not going to do this set in, and there we are, ground zero. Andrew's someone very much that I identify with. He was enthusiastic to start, but then you see his despair, you see the cynicism bear in with him at the end. He's a pragmatist. It's like, okay, we've got this little bit of food to start here, maybe we can figure something out. But his pragmatism doesn't get him very far in this situation. Any of you identify with Andrew? You have been there. You understand that's how you feel, and you may respond. Well, I want to share a personal experience of an impossible task that I had to face. Probably the worst situation, job-related, with success and failure on the line. I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps at the time, back in 1997. I was 21, maybe 22 years old. I was a fairly young sergeant, having been promoted, stationed in Hawaii, and we were about to have this multi-million-dollar new communications equipment that was being tested come in from California, and we were in the intelligence unit, and our unit was going to be the test unit for this new equipment. And so you got government contracts, you got DOD money, you've got officers and high-ranked enlisted coming in with a lot of reputation and money and all this pressure on them to see this equipment succeed. It was the first generation. And then you've got our little company, Alpha Company, 1st Rated Battalion. And we have the responsibility of approving or disapproving that this equipment can actually accomplish a job. And you've got our senior leadership have their own agenda and their own problems. And our senior enlisted, our master sergeant and our gunnery sergeant wanted nothing to do with this equipment. They thought it was a failure from the start. And so you had these opposing forces. Well, the Friday before the Monday where these people arrived, my senior sergeant, he had been a sergeant about 3 years longer than I had, got orders and he left to his new duty station elsewhere. And the new senior sergeant, who had 3-4 years of experience, a little bit about significantly more than what I had at the time, he was due to come in exactly 2 weeks' time. And this training period was going to take place for 2 weeks. So there I was, the senior sergeant, with all about a year of experience, only been in the Marine Corps for about 3.5 years total. And I have got forces at play and pressures and things going on all around me way, way outside of my pay grade. And it begins. And it was bad. The equipment's not working. They say it is. They say it's operator error. We're saying it's the equipment. You've got their lieutenants, their officers, and our officers going at it. Their master sergeant and our gunnery sergeant getting a pushing match, a shove, almost go to blows there in one of the rooms. And I'm sitting there as the sergeant responsible, but I have no power to change anything, realizing I am so over my head. In fact, I didn't want to come in the morning. I didn't want to show up. Because when I faced this pressure, how did I respond? I shrank down. I tried to avoid. As soon as the day was done, 16, 30, 1700, 1800, I would just go and I'd get away. I remember being very worried, being very anxious. Well, it was a terrible, terrible 2 weeks. Finished horribly. And I was pretty pathetic in how I managed the whole situation. As soon as it was over, I took some leave. I had to get away. Went to visit my friend in Arizona who had gotten out later, just a week away. They thought I did terribly. I spent the last 8 months of my time in the Marines. They sent me to the big island to watch equipment for 4 weeks, literally watch equipment, while the rest of the unit came. They sent me to the rifle range to coach people. No, I don't mind coaching people, but for my experience and level, they said, we got to get Zilke out of here. He did terribly. He destroyed this whole thing. Could I have succeeded? I don't know. But at the end of my time in, and I did get out after that, that was the assistance. If I wasn't sure, I was sure after that. What you're looking at here is my fitness report. A year's worth of time. And it was 2 weeks of failure. And that 2 weeks is highlighted here in yellow. He was reassigned from these billets due to lack of initiative and attention to duty. Needs to focus more on the needs of the Marine Corps. And they're right. I didn't stay after extra hours. I wasn't praying. I wasn't asking for help. I wasn't doing all the things a good young leader could have done or would have done. I hold on to this as motivation, hoping that I will never, ever fail. This clearly, again. But in the midst of the overwhelming pressure I faced, I crumbled. Now, why is this important? Because if you look at the text in John chapter 6, what does it say? When he asked Philip the question to the answer to the question, what did he already know? He knew he was going to fail. He knew he couldn't come up with an answer. And how many of us, think about it, think about your life, think about your current struggles, think about situations you've been in, when you felt like there is no way I'm going to succeed at this. There's no way I'm going to win. And what has been our thought process in that moment? We shrink. We fail. God gets wrapped into it. God, you set me up. God, you set me up to fail. You're somehow to blame. You didn't equip me. You didn't prepare me, whatever. And this morass of ugliness just kind of swirls all together. But what the disciples had the opportunity to see is that God had a plan bigger than this impossible test to fail. Jesus wasn't just setting them up to fail because he's some maniacal professor who wants to see you get a D on your final, withholding from you information or good planning, and some of us have had those types of professors and bosses and people in charge over us. Rather, Jesus was setting them up to fail in order to accomplish something very specific. Jesus was setting up his disciples to fail, first, to increase their need and dependence on him. Think about that. He knew what was going to happen. He presented questions they couldn't answer, problems they couldn't solve. Why would he do this? He did this fundamentally because Jesus needs his disciples and those of us who consider ourselves followers to be completely dependent upon him. The problem, you and I are very self-sufficient. You and I are very confident in our own abilities, or in our inability. When we face with that, we just want to ignore it. We want to avoid. A lot of us are avoiders. We want nothing to do with the prospect that we could fail, that we might not be able to accomplish something. But the thing we don't want to do is acknowledge our failure. The thing we don't want to do is look at the huge void, the huge need in our life, and be authentic and honest about, I just can't do this. But God He needs us to understand the depth of need and inability that we have to accomplish anything of value and worth in this world. Why? Because that's what He wants to do in us and through us. And so failure here is not a bad thing. Failure here was planned, and failure and struggle on the part of God, designing it for them, was so what? That's our second point, so that God could be their God, so He could perform their miraculous, so He could miraculously give them the food in that instance, or whatever provision you and I find ourselves in need of. But we don't want to humble ourselves. We don't want to bend a knee. We don't want to say, God, I can't do this. I can't accomplish this in and of myself. And therefore, I am going to actively drop to my knees and surrender and say, God, I need you to come through for me in this gap, in this need. That was the purpose. He set them up to fail, not to exploit them. He set them up to fail because He was going to do something that would grow their faith, would grow their confidence, would show them that God is not bound by the limits of this world that you and I play in and operate under. One of the challenges when we face real life struggles, when we face difficulties, and when we fail, and when the world fails us, is God gets wrapped into that. And somehow God's character and God's goodness and God's attentiveness to our needs is lost. But we're going to go back for the last portion of this message, and we're going to take a look at this because God was very attentive. Jesus was very attentive to both the disciples and the crowd as this whole thing is playing out. If you look in verse 2, He cared for the disciples. When He got up on the mountain, what does it say He did with them? It says He sat with His disciples. Did He get up on the mountain and quickly start barking out orders of what they needed to do? No, He sat with them. He talked with them. He brought them in. He entered into relationship with them, and He spent time with them. He was investing in them. He was valuing them. He was valuing the relationship that He had with His disciples. Few of us have had a leader, a mentor, a boss who has really taken the time to sit with us, to know us, to walk with us, to understand us, to really care and show care and love for us before He ever gave them the task that He knew they couldn't accomplish. And so when you and I think about being a follower and we're facing a trial, a struggle, some obstacle, and we think, God, this is too much, I can't handle this, do we realize that God has offered, or God has in fact sat down with us? He has loved us. He has communed with us. He's given us His Word, His Spirit, the body, and just Himself and His presence, and made Himself available to us. Yeah, the disciples still failed the test, but it wasn't about passing the test. I'm a test-passing guy. That's the most important thing to me. Winning, achieving, 100%. Jesus, it's about the relationship. And it's about the communing with and preparing and equipping his followers for what he ultimately wants them to do. And then what does he do? He looks up, he sees the crowd. This crowd has been following him. And why is the crowd following him? For the shallowest of reasons, because of the miracles he's doing. But how does he react to the crowd? He gets his disciples, who he's been investing in, and he says to them, as seeing the crowd, how are we going to provide for them? Doesn't become the hero, doesn't take it upon himself to think, I'm going to save the day. He invites those whom he's been pouring into and investing in and says, how are we now going to meet the needs of the crowd? The disciples didn't even know the crowd was hungry, or if they did, they didn't care. Did the crowd know that they were hungry? They might have, but did they expect? But after caring for his disciples, what does Jesus do for the crowd? He says we need to feed them. They didn't ask for food. Disciples didn't tell Jesus. Jesus says we need to feed them. Now this morning, you might not be a follower. You might not be an insider. You might not be walking with Jesus all that intimately. You might be part of the crowd. He's intriguing. I like some of the stuff he's done. I'm not sure I liked what he did there. But even as part of the crowd, Jesus has always sought to minister and to care for your needs. He's looked with compassion upon you when you didn't have an idea what it was you even needed at that time. And he has sought to train his people to help provide for your needs. Jesus cared for his disciples. He cared for the crowd. He even notes in the passage, where did he have them sit? Lush grass. Even John points that out. They sat on the grass. How many of us, when we're out hiking or going for a walk, like to sit in a puddle? We looked for that grassiest, driest place where we can sit and be comfortable. And John points out, that's where he had the people sit. Jesus is attentive to the needs of the crowd. And so this morning, as we consider this interaction with Jesus and his disciples and the crowd, a couple questions that we need to consider as we close. Question one is this. Those of you here, are you a disciple, a follower of Jesus, or are you part of the crowd? Just because we walk through the doors on Sunday, just because we have regular attendance here, regular attendance at a small group, just because we go downtown and we serve with some regularity, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are part of the disciples sitting with and communing with Jesus. We could still be part of the crowd. Now, if the crowd is where you are, we just need to acknowledge that. Oh, that was mine. It's my timer. But we might need to acknowledge that. I'm really just in the crowd. I think I'm a disciple. I think I'm a follower. But really, are you sitting with Jesus? Are you letting him direct you to the needs of the crowd, the needs of the people whom he wants to love in your life, family, friends? Are you really interested and active in obeying his directives towards you? Or are you simply just following along, excited at the miracles he's doing, and maybe you'll get lucky and you'll get your belly full at the same time? If you're part of the crowd, Jesus loves you. If you think you're a follower, a disciple, and you're a crowd member, we need to acknowledge that. And if you're a disciple, God loves you. He wants to nurture you. He is a good God. He wants to train you. He wants to equip you. He wants to give you everything you need for the purpose that he has for you here on this earth. And believe me, he absolutely has a purpose for all of us if we will accept it on this time on this earth. Second question that we need to consider has to do with our failures. Past failures. So some of you have faced some tests, some obstacles in the past, and you did fail, or felt like you were failed, and there are consequences. Are you still holding on to bitterness and anger in your life because of something that happened? Maybe it was outside your control. Maybe Gunny Amos's fight with that master sergeant was outside of my control, and God, it's not fair that I failed, and a year's worth of time in the Marines doesn't matter. If you're bitter, if you're angry, if you're holding on to something, you've got to repent. You've got to let it go. Because of past failures, have you stopped taking risks? Have you stopped asking God for greater impact? Have you stopped dreaming bigger dreams with what He might be able to do with your life and your ministry and the light that you shine in Him and the impact that you can have in your sphere and in this world? Have you accepted, no, I'm good. Cruise control. I'll just lock it in and we'll go from here. Don't let your past failures have that type of impact on you. And then our present struggles. What is the test that you may be facing currently where you feel like you might fail? Some of us in this room are facing an obstacle, an objective, a challenge, and we feel like we might fail. We might not be able to get past this. Your ongoing search for the right job or career where you can finally invest yourself fully and not just have to do something on the side until you find that lifelong desire, vocation. Your marriage, which is really hard, and it's been hard for a while, and you're not sure it's going to get better. Will they finally change? Or more importantly, will you finally change? Our Christian lives in general, I just mentioned, I feel like we've accepted nominal Christian living. I just got to ride this out. I got my groove. I got my house. I got my family. I got my job. I got my group. I'm just going to kind of do my thing. And we have closed off the possibility that God could and would ask something significantly more of us. And in general, are we just maybe cynical about how it all will pan out? There's a couple cynics in here. I can be one. A cynical attitude will corrode any effort the Spirit makes in your life to get things moving forward. When you're facing failure, when you're facing the possibility of not succeeding at something, when you're facing the ramifications of what that would mean to your identity, to your value, to your worth, can I fail and can it be okay? Remember this, that Jesus knows how this will end. Let me say that again. Jesus knows how this will end. It's clearly there in the passage. He knows. He knows. Jesus knows what He will do. You are not abandoned. You are not alone. You're not on your own to figure this out. He knows how it will end, and even more importantly, He knows what He will do. He will not leave you abandoned. And even as we scramble and try in our own abilities, or maybe we don't even try, He has a plan. Maybe not our plan, maybe not our idea of how it should end, but He has a plan to be the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000 that we don't even know yet that we want or need.